Hey, Dr. Emily McMahan.
Good
How are you?
morning. I'm good. How are you?
I'm super, thank you, and incredibly excited today to have you in front of me. So thank you for taking the time out of your clinic. I know it's super early for you in Alaska today, and obviously I'm here in London. And I'm really looking forward to sharing and discussing our shared topic, which is a passion for ears. And I think it's safe to say that you are, without question, undoubtedly the queen of Lenire. And you've probably fitted more Lenire to any tinnitus sufferers out there than anyone else in the world. Do you think that's probably right?
I believe that is correct at this point. That's what I am told. Certainly wasn't the goal, but it's where we've ended up. So here we
Well,
go.
that is exactly why I would love to rack your brain today. One of the reasons being is because there is a fair amount of skepticism out there when it comes to this technology. And so I really want to take this opportunity to set the score straight once and for all. So my first question to you, we'll dive straight in, is more about you and why tinnitus? What's your mission, and why is this subject so important to you?
Yes, I think it's kind of a two-part answer. Part one, the easiest quick answer is once I had decided to go into audiology, I knew I wanted to go into private practice. That was never a question in my life. But my mom had had tinnitus for many years and had never at that moment in her life been burdensome, but it definitely was a topic of conversation. And so it was something that I was interested in, but more from a curiosity angle. And then when I was in school, it was just fascinating to me that we have such a large population of people impacted negatively and often quite catastrophically by their tinnitus. And there were so many unknowns. And there are still many unknowns, to be fair, but I loved the up and coming science, the ability to still be searching, looking, going through more options, and really just being on the forefront of that. And then I was in Philadelphia for my program for my AUD, which happens to be right next to an amazing tinnitus provider who's known all over, Dr. Gail Brenner. And I begged and begged and begged, pleaded and begged some more until she finally allowed me to come to her clinic. And I ended up spending a year at her clinic as an AUD student because I wanted to learn as much as I could about tinnitus. So why not learn from one of the best? And that really went from this is what I'm doing to 100% kind of lighting a fire of this is what I am going to do in my future career. And so that passion just continued and grew, and here we are today.
And how much of your day is taken up by tinnitus then? Is it everything you do from an audiology standpoint, or do you cover any other aspects of audiology?
So I do own a private practice and I have other providers that are in my practice and we serve a full scope of clinic minus vestibular. It's not a service that we offer. However, at this point in my individual professional career, I am 99.9% tinnitus. Occasionally, being a practice owner, I might need to jump in or get asked to help, or maybe someone needs their behind or things happen and I have to jump in and kind of put on my other audiology hat. But to be perfectly fair, I am 99% tinnitus. And so that is my day up to day down, most days of the week, off hours and on. And to be fair, I wouldn't change it for anything at this point.
Okay, so I'm definitely speaking to the right person here then. So next big question then, and like I say, I really want to get into the weeds on this. So the biggest question that I want to ask, I think today, is talking about the effectiveness of Lenire. And the reason I feel the need to do this is, and we were speaking just before this call, every time I put a video out there talking about Lenire, whether it's interviewing somebody or reviewing the tech, or whatever it might be, there is a tirade of skepticism in the comments. And I want to utilize today as an opportunity to dispel some of those myths that are out there. So
Sure.
to kick off from your point of view, I have seen, I hope you don't mind me saying this, I've seen the term snake oil branded multiple times when it comes to Lenire. Is bimodal neuromodulation just a fad?
So I want to first kind of address part of that. And I understand why so many patients have extreme skepticism in any type of tinnitus management. And I think that that needs to be acknowledged and not just acknowledged, but recognized that they have often been through a myriad of unsuccessful and unvalidated options. That could be from a Google search, it could be from a Facebook ad following them from a Google search, it could just be from being on a blog. So I think it's understandable when a population of people is seeking an answer and there's not a lot of verifiable information out there, that they feel very taken advantage of, because when you're searching for information, it is almost impossible to know what's real, what's not real, what's a solid website, what's a gimmick, what's a fake, and it has to be exhausting. And so I think from that angle, that first and foremost, that they should be acknowledged that it is exhausting to know what's a real choice versus another poor direction or another fad, because we've all seen things come and go. And for anyone in tinnitus to have not acknowledged that aspect of it, they've probably not been in the field very long. So I think that's kind of step one, is you have to recognize, but also allow them that skepticism coming in, because you're probably not their step one. You're probably their step 30, if not longer on the list. And potentially some of these patients that I see have had tinnitus longer than I've been alive. And so, we have to recognize that first and foremost, because how incredibly frustrating to just be searching for answers and feel like there has never been a potential choice that you feel is safe. So that's kind of the part one, because there are definitely lots of options out there that I wish we could get rid of a magic button and just erase things off the internet so that we could guide patients in a more safe and better direction. On the part two of that, I think skepticism is also valid anytime something new is coming. And I would be amiss if I didn't share that when I was one of those phase 1 providers and we all got to go over to Ireland, because it wasn't approved in the US yet, which means those first few 14 of us all received our hands-on training in Ireland, just because we couldn't receive hands-on training here yet in the States. And at the completion of our training, we all were a little skeptics of the device and of the treatment and how it would work. And not because the information that we hadn't been shared with us was excellent, because it was. In fact, many of us, I think, left every day from kind of class, so to say, a little mind blown of, wow, this is a huge step in a different direction. But also the trust that comes with being a provider in the tinnitus world, and know that we were going to bring something back that I couldn't ask my colleagues about, other than this tiny group of people who are in the exact same position of me, of I'm about to put my neck out here, and this could potentially be one of the best clinical decisions of my life, and it could have potentially been a catastrophic clinical decision that I had made. So I think it's also good for patients to recognize that in the very beginning, we also were just as, okay, the science looks good, the data looks good, the clinical trials look good, but I want to touch this. I want my patients with me together, and I need to see these actions to be able to really feel like I can dive into this very confidently. Now, I will say, thankfully, in this situation, we quickly, as a group, that kind of first group of providers, were finding market success very early on. And that allowed us to gain confidence. It allowed us to gain clinical recommendations. It allowed us to feel really secure in making those clinical recommendations for those early on patients. And I think that's important, because we too, as providers, are going, is this the right solution? Are we making right recommendations? How do we track it? What do we look like? Because it can be a little disconcerting to say, here's all of the data from another country, or here's all of the data from another provider, when I may not know that provider really well. And so to borrow someone's information is a little hard in those early stages. Now, I can thankfully say, now that we're 2+ years in, I get to talk about my data, and not just my data, but my peer-reviewed data, which is even more cool for the tinnitus patients. And I can then say, I have this patient that's very similar in nature to you, or I have been through this experience, or that's not an uncommon situation, and here's how we've handled it. So for those patients very early on, we had a lot of unknowns ourselves as providers, and I would also safely say that we were pretty open about that. But now at this point, I don't necessarily know that there's something that I'm not up for the challenge, and it's not always bimodal, but of kind of tackling that challenge together with the sheer amount of data and information that we've all been collecting over these past years to better further tinnitus forward. I am very thankful to say that Lenire, I would like to never be without in my clinical practice again. It has been quite life-changing for the majority of my patients that have been prescribed and are using it. It's also, though, not without note that there have been patients that have tried Lenire and have not been successful. But we're talking about an 8.5% non-successful outcome rate to a 91.5% successful outcome rate. And so when you're looking at it from then, and it is heartbreaking and it is very frustrating to figure out, why did that person not respond? But when I look back to statistics and kind of percentages prior to Lenire, right now this bimodal neuromodulation is having wonderfully positive, repetitious outcomes. And that's been so exciting to see as a provider who's been in this field for a while and has not ever been able to talk about outcome measures in such a strong, validated set.
And are you still using alternative methods of tinnitus therapy as well? It's not just Lenire that you do. You're not using a one-size-fits-all approach. Are you using a balanced approach when it comes to managing tinnitus?
So I am using a balanced approach. It would also be inappropriate to not say that I'm not using Lenire quite heavily at this point, just with how well the outcome measures are looking. But there are some patients that are not candidates, whether it be a medical contraindication, maybe they have some different kind of specific types of hyperacusis, in which case I'm worried about overstimulation from the auditory system. Maybe they have reasons that we can't use their tongue. We had a patient not that long ago that had some facial paralysis, didn't have good feeling to their tongue. If they can't feel the stimulation on their tongue, I, in good conscience, shouldn't be putting them in something that the bimodal piece is ear and tongue. Also, sometimes there's patients that, just for a variety of reasons, they're not a good fit for Lenire. Maybe time-wise they can't do it. Maybe they don't have the ability to dedicate that time. Maybe it's just not a good solution for them. Some patients also we kind of need to 2-for-1 it. Maybe we have a really significant hearing loss and significant tinnitus, and prior they've not attempted to address hearing loss, and we find out that I only get one shot, and what is it that I can do? Both are equally a problem. So, I mean, I think when you're looking at it, there's a variety of reasons. Now, will I fit Lenire on someone with untreated hearing loss? Yes, I will. Why? Because my outcome rates of fitting hearing loss and then using Lenire, and not fixing hearing loss and using Lenire, those users are coming out at the same level of success. But I'm not here to force them into what treatment or recommendation plans they are. I'm here to guide them and to give them all of the information that we have available and allow them to make what they feel is the most appropriate decision. It doesn't mean that I'm not recommending both, and it doesn't mean that both might not be a part of their picture in the grand scheme of things, but they get to pick which part of that treatment plan do we want to move forward with, and then I'm here to help them guide that along for success. And so, having hearing loss doesn't mean that I will not talk about hearing aids, and it doesn't mean that I won't talk about Lenire, but you, the patient, have to let me as the provider know what order are we willing and wanting to tackle this, and then I'm here to support you for that. And so I still also am using cognitive behavioral therapy within my clinic. We regularly are recommending Otto, which is a CBT app throughout the UK as well. You may be familiar.
Yeah, we use it in our clinic as well. It's great.
Okay,
yeah, it's a really great tool to supplement.
It is. And for some of those patients, it's been a critical and crucial missing piece. And so I think I would like to say most, if not all, kind of true tinnitus clinics, we shouldn't be a one size fits all. We should have multiple tools that we can reach for, because each patient needs a little something different. And we might even use each tool slightly different for each patient. We have some patients that can hit the ground running with Lenire right off the bat, and we have some patients that we kind of ease into the listening sessions. Some patients we have to make sure. So I think you just have to look at it from that angle of have lots of tools, listen to the patient, and then how do we give each patient the best level of tool for success in their individual situation? And that's, I think, why we're finding so much success, is so many of these patients prior to Lenire being available had tried many other options. And so right now, especially, we've got this large subset of patients that have tried the traditional methods with some success, for a temporary time frame, or without success. And so now kind of the next thing that we've been able to add in is this. But we also, though, shouldn't leave those other tools behind when we're working even with Lenire, so that we can help appropriately counsel and guide and support those patients through the tinnitus journey, which is never downhill. It's usually a series of roller coasters, good days, hard days, excellent days, really hard times. And so I think, having those optional tools allows us to be able to better work with those patients.
I love the passion in which you talk about all of this. I've kind of dived into this, assuming that everybody watching this video knows what Lenire is and how it works. So do you want to give a brief explanation in terms of how
Sure.
Lenire changes what the brain perceives?
Sure. So piece one, Lenire, is what's called bimodal neuromodulation. So bimodal meaning two types of stimuli. The first type of stimuli is going to be a set of over-the-ear headphones. This is where that audiogram or that hearing evaluation comes into play. As I was mentioning before, you can have hearing loss and use Lenire, and you can have completely normal hearing and use Lenire, but we do need those metrics for how your ear hears so that we can program the device individually to your right ear thresholds and to your left ear thresholds. So that's piece one of the bimodal. Piece two is this little tongue tip stimulator. Got these little silver electrodes there on the end. Just kind of hang out on the tip of your tongue. I describe this to patients like a super carbonated drink. So super fizzy, that first little kind of tickle tingle that you get from the carbonation.
Have you tried it yourself as well?
I have. This is mine.
Okay.
I like to call it a little brain timeout when I'm needing to just give myself a moment. I've had intermittent tinnitus since college. At this point, one would think exhaustingly speaking about tinnitus would only make mine more obvious to myself, but I'm quite thankful to actually say that luckily I do so much counseling on how we don't focus on our tinnitus that mine is almost never apparent to me at this point. But I have had intermittent tinnitus for a period of time, but thankfully most of the time it stays in the background and behaves itself. But on days I have fully gone through a session, 12-week cycle with Lenire, but on days that mine is bothering me, this is my friend, and we just have a little quiet, we have a little relaxation, little kind of timeout for myself, and usually gets me right back in check. And then we've got the controller, which is where kind of your programming buttons are going to be, as well as kind of how the audiologist is going to program the device for you. So that's the bimodal piece and kind of what the technology looks like. And then the neuromodulation. How I like to break that down is our brain is always learning and able to learn and receive new information. What the goal of tinnitus management is not stopping the ringing or stopping the tinnitus, but the goal is to teach the brain a better response pattern to the tinnitus. And so depending upon who or what the patient is and how we're discussing or other things that we have identified, I'll often give some examples of what that might look like. And so, for example, I might say things like, I can see that you're wearing a shirt today, and you probably haven't thought about your shirt since you got dressed in the morning, unless someone weirdly points it out, or you've spilled on yourself and you're like, oh man, now I've got something all over my shirt. Our brain can have something physically present, like a shirt or like tinnitus, and depending on if we're able to not focus on it, not give it kind of real estate, not give it that value, then our brain doesn't think about it. Even though it hasn't left, we physically know that it's present. And that's what we want to do with your tinnitus. I can't tell your brain to stop creating that sound. I wish that I could. I would probably not have to see so many tinnitus patients if we could do that. However, what we can do, and with neuromodulation, it's been really successful, is teaching the brain that better response pattern so that your brain can say, okay, you can be there, but you're not going to be here. We're going to kind of help move you around. And I also tell my patients, at the end of this, I can ask you, do you hear tinnitus? And I'm more expecting you to say, yes, it's right there. But the difference is it's right here and it's not here. And so kind of looking at from that burdensome or intrusiveness, it's not to say that there's not tinnitus, and it's not to say that you don't have tinnitus, but if we can take tinnitus and get it out of the spotlight and move it to so far in the background that we're now doing activities, going to work, enjoying our friends and family, going to sleep, being able to do all these activities, it doesn't really matter if it's still there, if it's no longer taking the spotlight in your every action or activities throughout the day. And so with the neuromodulation, I think one thing that's been really lovely is that for this huge population of people who sitting and relaxing and having quiet time is like a torture wish for them, they're able to sit. They're able to have positive sound stimulation, the tongue tip stimulation, a little strange feeling at first, but kind of quickly get over that sensation. And they're able to have that rest and relaxation and quiet time while they're also actively helping their brain redirect and form this new positive pathway or neutral pathway. And so I think that's been one of the game changers, is to have a subset of people who are often hiding from sound or hiding from silence and drowning silence out with sound. We're still using sound, but we're giving their brain a way to just allow it to calm, allow it to relax, allow them that ability to have that down quiet time while we're positively doing active treatment to be working towards a positive direction. And so, like I said, when we're looking at that, I think bimodal neuromodulation is cool, but I think a lot of people get a little overwhelmed with what it's doing. And so taking it back to just understanding that every day we learn new things. Every day we have the ability of learning new things. And how are we teaching our brain and then giving our brain that good repetition to have that stable response is really what our ultimate goal here is. And in my experience, and it sounds like in yours as well, this has been a really favorable outcome for the majority of our patients.
I mean, it sounds like you're almost saying that you're putting people in the driving seat when it comes to their tinnitus and giving them back control in a world where they've felt pretty helpless and not been able to control it in the past, and the tinnitus has been taking them for a ride instead.
Agreed. And I do think that patients having that acceptance and that ability to say, this is my tinnitus and this is where we're taking my tinnitus is important, because having tinnitus and owning one's tinnitus can have a little bit different of a mindset.
Yeah.
Because we can have tinnitus and allow it to just take over everything and also not allow us to feel that we're strong enough to be able to work on it. And then if we have tinnitus and it is taking over everything, and by no means am I not saying that it's not often and can be severe and catastrophically intrusive, but if they're willing to say, you know what, I do have tinnitus and I am going to make a change for this, and I'm not just going to let it rule everything, we can come up with really constructive ways for them to take control back. That could be using Lenire, could be using other tools. And then more often than not throughout the day, they might have little tips and tricks that have nothing to do with Lenire. We might talk about breath work. We might talk about how to give yourself a 5-second timeout. We might talk about, you know what, push back from your desk, stand up, go get a drink of water, come back. It doesn't always have to be this large intervention. Sometimes we just need to say, hey, you know what, brain? I'm not getting stuck in this right now. I'm not going to allow you to just kind of bring that tinnitus and creep it up and creep it up and creep it up. I'm going to stand up and go do a new activity for a moment. And so with each patient, finding what do those little moments look like? How do we gain back that control? How do we give them the narrative to say, not right now, this isn't what we're doing? And being able to work towards that is really powerful in giving them the control back over, rather than feeling like the tinnitus is in control of all of their activities.
And are you finding that most of the people that you see and that you're fitting with Lenire are patients that have exhausted every other option, or are you often the first port of call? What does that balance look like?
So especially in the first year, so especially 23 to early 24, heavily those patients had been through every avenue. Many of those patients were highly informed, had been heavily watching different forums and FDA and just different posts. And those are your patients that had been seeking alternative care and additional care for years. So especially in the first year, those patients, I would say, had always tried a myriad of previous therapies. I do think as Lenire is becoming more, I don't think we're quite at commonplace, but more accessible in terms of kind of ease of accessibility and knowledge. Sometimes we will get people that is kind of, they've had tinnitus for a while, but they've never attempted kind of formal treatment options. So I will say we get some of those now. I still feel though like the majority of patients have done something before. Maybe not quite as many treatment options as in years past, but rarely would I say that this is step one for patients in their tinnitus journey.
And what kind of commitment is using Lenire? We've not covered that. So is it something that needs to be used every day, every week, every month? And how long is the duration that you'd recommend? And I asked that question based on the fact that you said, sometimes if you're stressed, overwhelmed, you've had one of those days, you just sit down, chill out with your Lenire, pop it in your mouth, and then it gives you some respite.
Sure. So in my clinic, we talk about active therapy time, and then we call it maintenance mode. So when I'm first talking to my patients, I'm asking them for the first 12 weeks to the best of their ability, 2 30-minute sessions per day, hopefully with little to no misses within there, with the exception of we're all people and there will never be a negative in the sense of coming from me to you if you had to miss a session or we needed to do that. But I also then ask them if they find themselves suddenly missing more sessions, please reach out to me. Let's figure out what's going on so that we can keep that good repetitivity and repetition early on. So at the end of the 12 weeks, because we've been working together through that 12 weeks, I will ask them, where are you at with your goals? Have we accomplished them? Do we have more to go? Are you feeling comfortable if I suggest not using the device? And there, I'll get a wide answer. I will get, yes, I'm comfortable. I feel really good. I'm good to take a break, and we'll take a break. I will get the, I've accomplished my goals, but I'm a little afraid to stop using it. And that's valid, because how empowering that you've found a tool finally that's doing something, and that's understandably a little scary to take it away. And in that case, typically I'll talk about, well, let's kind of wean off of it. We don't have to stop today. So let's go from 2 a day down to 1 a day. And then when you're feeling comfortable at 1 a day and we're maintaining that good level, then let's go from 1 a day to not. We kind of work through that process. And then we've got the third group, which they're not ready yet. Maybe we've made it really far, but we're still making good progression. The brain doesn't just stop learning at 12 weeks, so let's keep going. So, we've kind of got, yes, let's stop, ready, but not ready, and we kind of wean, and then we've got that third group of, I have more work to do, and I'm doing well, and I want to continue this progress point. And so those are kind of step one, and all of that's kind of part of that active therapy time. Once we switch over to what I call maintenance mode, is that's going to look a little different for everybody. So for some patients, maintenance mode might be once a week. It might be once a quarter. It might be only on a day where your kids didn't sleep and you're like, I got no sleep last night. I know my tinnitus is going to bother me. So before it becomes to that point, pick it back up, put it back on, give yourself that little refresher, and then put it back away again. And so maintenance mode, I think, is important because we maintain every area of our health, whether that's a good bedtime routine, whether that's a food routine, whether that's an activity routine, whether that's a work and life and balance routine. We have to maintain our whole life. And so remember, the goal is not to not have tinnitus. The goal is to not have intrusive and bothersome tinnitus. So we're just going to maintain that too. So we've hopefully gotten our tinnitus to a really good place where we, the patient, are saying, I'm okay with this. This is not phasing me at all. So now let's maintain that. And so, like I said, that could be a little bit of maintenance. It could be a lot. It could be that you've had a really stressful week at work and it's just everything's feeling a little more burdensome, from just not feeling as great to not sleeping as great to not eating as great. And life just kind of has those moments. So let's put the device back on and we'll just kind of keep maintaining the tinnitus. And I think that's important because so many of these patients come to us and they feel like they're alone and they don't feel like they have a place to turn. And now you've got a provider and you've got a relationship with your provider that you can call on a bad day and say, hey, can we have a touch point? And you've got a team that you can reach out to and say, I don't know what I need other than, can I talk about my tinnitus for a few minutes? I'm having a hard time. Yes, absolutely. Let's share. And then even more importantly, so often than not, thank you, tinnitus, our bad moments happen when most people are not around or awake or able to respond. Don't wait. Pick up the device that at this point in most patients' experiences has been a really positive tool, and let's put it on. Let's get there. And then in the morning or when you have the ability, then we can have an appointment. And so having a tool and having a team of resources, I think, is a really empowering option also for those patients because they're not alone in this journey now. And so I think, when you're looking at it for there, that's how maintenance works. So I've got some patients that do almost no maintenance. And I have some that do a little bit more maintenance, and there's not a wrong answer because we all know people that run for fun all of the time. I am not one of those people. And then we have people who I like to hike and go for long hikes, and people are like, that's crazy, and I enjoy it, and I don't experience the running aspect of it. So we all maintain our lives in different avenues. So why not allow our tinnitus maintenance to look individual as well?
I mean, it looks like you've described a fully personalized program then that you figure out with each of those patients individually and react accordingly and provide an all-round patient-led, patient-centered approach in terms of tinnitus management, which actually leads me nicely on to some of my next questions, which were all around data and the research that's out there.
Sure.
And the reason I say that is because early days there was data, but it was all lab-based, all around Lenire being used with very strict criteria. But your research has been quite different, right? You've done a retrospective study.
Yes.
And I'm going to have to look at the title of this because I will not be able to recall it. So it is a retrospective chart review demonstrating effectiveness of bimodal neuromodulation for tinnitus treatment in a clinical setting.
It's quite a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, and I was never going to try and learn that. So what was your goal with this research then? This is more practical. This is more real life, real patients, real experiences, right?
It is. And so I think that for providers, especially in healthcare, we recognize that there's a lot of preemptive clinical research before it ever makes it to the person or it makes it to clinical trials. And clinical trials are clean, they are tidy, they have very compliant patients, and they're kind of best case scenario. And there's nothing wrong with that. But we also need best case scenario to put together a really clean case study that we can actually measure real results. Because if it's not a complete case study, how do you produce data? So there's nothing wrong.
Just jumping in there, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but you might have a day where someone wakes up and they've had a bad night sleeping. They don't have time to do tinnitus training or to use Lenire, or they may be on holiday and they forget the device, or it might be something that's just real. And therefore, I guess the ultimate goal is to find out if this treatment has the same impact for those users at home who mess it up every now and then.
Yeah, because in clinical trials, part of being a clinical trial participant is really truly agreeing not having those life moments, and that for the next whatever time frame that they are committed to, because obviously every clinical trial is going to be different, they are making a commitment to pretty much perfectly follow protocols, right?
Yeah.
And I think you and I can agree, real life very rarely is clean and tidy and perfect, and we all make mistakes throughout the day, and it's messy, and that's life. But what this work that Dr. Hubert Lim, so he kind of published on his side of the clinical trials and the beforehand, and then all of my work is if this is my patients' data. So these are my real patients that I've seen in my practice, and it's messy. Patients are messy. Sometimes things happen. Sometimes they have an accident. Sometimes they forget. Sometimes they do go on vacation. I had a patient who went on vacation, and even though I had highly encouraged him not doing it from the plane, he left his Lenire 3 weeks in on the plane.
No.
Guess what that means? We now didn't have a Lenire, right? No, he didn't do it on purpose, but that threw a giant wrench in our treatment plan because we now had no Lenire. And bless the cleaning crew, they probably just thought it was a charger and a set of headphones, and off it went. And so real life is messy, but real life is where we all live. And so what the goal of this research was to show was, think of it like a translational. So we have the clinical trials, and then we're going to translate that into real humans, not in a clinical trial setting, in a real life, all over the place setting. And so that's where the mouthy name comes from, is just explaining that this is, we've seen these patients, we're pulling data from these charts, and then we're showing this in a private clinical setting, not in a clinical research lab setting. And what we have found really excitingly is that at the 6-week point, 78% of patients were already exhibiting marked progress in a forward moving motion. And 78% is incredible, to be fair.
Yeah.
But even more exciting is that when we got to that 12-week number, which remember is not a magic number, 91.5% of patients were reporting on two kind of sides of that parameters. One of those parameters is this being helpful? And 88% of them verbally said, yes, this was helpful. 91.5% of them demonstrated from clinical scales using like the tinnitus handicap inventory, for example, which is those questions of yes, sometimes, and no. They had shown a minimal clinical significance in a positive change on their THI. So we had kind of the verbal answer, which is always most important because I want to know how you feel as a person. And then the data of the science of how their subset scales were shifting and changing for the better was then also being supported in those changes. And it was kind of one of those moments where I knew overall things were going incredibly well because my follow-ups were going incredibly well. But I'm not a clinical researcher. I am an audiologist, and while I love science, I've never been the numbers girl. And so to start putting it into that spreadsheet and start looking at the data and seeing the data coming to life, it was a really incredible moment to see all of these positive follow-ups. Holy cow, look at what we're finding. And it wasn't just me looking at some of my colleagues across the states of whom had that early clinical access as well. Several of us have presented different trials. So you've got Boston, you've got Manhattan, you've got Alaska. Now remember, I'm also kind of West Coast, so not just Alaska. But there is nothing similar to Manhattan, Boston, and Alaska for the record, or California. We are very different halves of the country. But to see those patients with incredibly different lives having extremely repeatable and similar outcomes was incredible. And I think for those of us that were early on, it was really exciting to be able to talk about what we were finding in the real world, because clinical trials are important and they are absolutely needed. But to be able to say to patients, this is what a regular person like you is finding across the country, is a much more strong statement than what was found in clinical trials. And so that's what, if I know you've been able to look at it, but looking at that paper, that's what we're looking at, is what are these? And because everyone always asks, we track all of that. So, I mean, we track how they're using it. We're tracking kind of dates and times, and there are set follow-ups within this, which is how we were able to do translational. In the clinical trials, it was a baseline, a 6-week, and a 12-week. So my patient's data is based on a baseline, a 6-week, a 12-week. Now we are continuing to collect more data, and we are continuing this research, but we made it as equal as we can, from perfect clinical setting to messy real life setting, to be able to show patients in the real world, this is what we're finding. And thankfully, it's been really successful.
I'm just keen on making sure everybody understands what you're talking about. You mentioned THI as well as a measurement tool. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so there are some different questionnaires that are used. In the clinical trials for Lenire, they used the scale called the Tinnitus Handicap Inventory. It's a 0 to 100 scoring system. And then there's 5 categories: slight or no handicap, mild, moderate, severe, and catastrophic. And for our patients here, we're looking at the moderate, severes, and catastrophic level. That's who is most recommended to be using Lenire. And so when we're looking at it from that angle, that's the same subset of questionnaires that the same exact people see repetitively throughout their treatment process. Now, I also use some other scales in my clinic, but for the data that was reported here, I needed to use the most similar data to the clinical trials. And so everyone kind of gets like a starting category, so to say, which typically depicts how intrusive their tinnitus is on a day-to-day basis. And then we're watching those numbers change, which means we're often shifting heavily in a lesser category from where we began. And looking in the paper, and I don't have these numbers off the top of my head, but we kind of break it down into categories of, generally when they start in the catastrophic, we see X average of a change, generally in severe, generally in moderate. And so it kind of gives us this general idea of what types of changes we often are expecting to see these patients experience, which allows me on an individual basis to give a little bit more specific kind of parameters for what success might look like, and for what we're looking for to make sure that our goals are aligned before we even get started, now that we have some concrete information that we're able to reflect upon and use moving forward.
And we talk about how it's great having this real life evidence. How did that compare to the evidence that you've got from the lab, or that Lenire have based on the lab?
Yeah. So actually, our real life data has been more favorable than the clinical trial data.
Oh, really?
It has been. And this is where I think the most important piece of this comes into play. The clinical trial data showed that bimodal neuromodulation works. Through 3 separate clinical trials, they had to prove that this wasn't placebo. They had to prove that this worked. They had to prove that the tongue and adding in that second mode of stimulation was more effective than just sound. They had all of these different arms of trials, so to say, that had to prove each step of the way that this was an actual change and not just a perceived change or a placebo change. That was their job in the clinical trials. And like I said, there were 3 separate ones, 3 separate countries. Each country had kind of a different necessary outcome that they needed to see repeated. In real life, we didn't have to prove that side of it, other than we had to work with real patients who are coming in with a lot of skepticism, and then being able to walk through it from that angle, which is also even harder often. And so I think when you're kind of looking through those 2 different lenses, we had the first part, But what the clinical trials didn't have were people like me and people like you. So the clinical trial people, they received the device, they received training on how to utilize the device, and they did receive a device prescribed for them. But they didn't have counseling and follow-up in the angle of appointments and support and a provider relationship. They had touch points, they had checkpoints. I mean, they're by no means am I not saying that they didn't have that, but they didn't have a connection and a support and a support team. Whereas in the real world, if my patients needed me 10 times, I'm going to talk to them 10 times that week. If they needed me every day for a set period, I'm going to talk to them every day. I'm not only speaking to them at set 1, set 2, set 3, which is what the clinical trials were, because their job was to prove the device worked. I don't care if the device works. I care if my patient does well. And so there's more to it than just that. We need to look at their sleep. We need to look at their behavior. We need to look at what their routines look like. We need to look at their usage of their Lenire. We need to look at all of those pieces. But that's where what we talked about earlier, that accountability, that ownership, that ability to say, this is the steps that I'm going to be taking. And it's not just putting the device on and doing it. There's work that goes into that. And so I think the difference that we saw was the device stood on its own and the device on its own worked. And that's excellent. But then when we saw the device paired with a knowledgeable provider who's been trained to work with these patients that can be incredibly hard, the outcomes were so much better, because it's not just a device. It's, do you have good counseling? Do you have good parameters? Do you know what the right goals are? If someone's goal is to never hear the tinnitus again, we need a timeout, because I'm setting them up for failure. And I don't want to set them up for failure. And so, little things like that can't be replaced by a tool. That is a person, that is knowledge, that is training, that is trust in a relationship with your provider, and the ability to be vulnerable and say, I need help with this, or I'm struggling with this. And so I think that's important, is find a provider you connect with. Find a provider that's not just the first one that you found, but find one that you feel you can work with and open up with, because the real life data showed that when we had an excellent provider and we had excellent technology, outcomes were fantastic. And so I think that's important, because devices are fun, but as people, we like the fastest option every time. Can I just take a pill? Can I go to bed and it all disappear? Can I just do one really hard workout and feel like I've made it? Or we all want that. Even if we all know that's not realistic, we all wish that we could just done. And so having that person to keep you accountable, having that person to verbally say, this wasn't my best week. Okay, let's look at it. What can we figure out? What do we need to improve upon? Every week you keep talking about this. Have we gotten you a referral to talk to a provider? It sounds, having those working relationships, I think, is all the difference in the world between having a tool that works and then having a tool and a person that we can put that highest level of care together. And that's why we're seeing our real world evidence being that much more effective than just the clinical trials.
And this just goes to show the importance of the audiologist in this entire process. And that could be said for anything when it comes to audiology as well, whether it's a hearing aid fitting. You can have the best hearing aid technology in the world, but unless it's not necessarily about programming, it's about the ongoing rehabilitation, the counseling, all of that care, and the bond that we form with our patients too, right? It's one of the reasons why I absolutely adore the job that I do, because I get to spend time with these people. I've some of the same patients that I've been seeing for 15 years now. And it's really hard, I guess, to measure that. And one could argue that there's a possibility that it'll not skew the results when it comes to Lenire, because I would hope that Lenire and the lab-based results that they've got, that sets the lower threshold, and then anything else on top of that is basically a bonus. But it's really important that, I guess, Lenire and Neuromod provide the training necessary with the right audiologists to ensure that they can put the icing on the cake.
Yep. And I do think that's important. And I certainly can't speak to other parts of the world in terms of what the accessibility looks like. But I know within the United States, that's been a very intentional rollout on working with already trained tinnitus providers and not just the fastest person to say, I want the tool. Because I think as you and I both see tinnitus patients, we can appreciate that you can't just wake up today and decide this is what you're doing. I mean, technically you can, you're licensed to do so, but you're not going to be giving your patient the best chance for success if you don't have the back end information, knowledge, tools, counseling skills, and even more importantly, sometimes referral resources for those other avenues that we need to address. And so I will say, like I said, for within the United States, that's why the rollout has been very deliberate and very intentional. And so I know for some pockets of the country, still people feel like they may not have a lot of accessibility. And it's certainly not because the team at Neuromod doesn't want to have accessibility, but they also want to make sure that when a patient goes into an office, that to the best of everybody's ability, they're in a supported clinical setting.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. You could roll it out to every audiology practice out there, and then I'm sure there'll be a ton of people looking for that quick fix, and we'll say we'll give it a go, and the outcome measures will be far poorer than if you've got the right people using the right tools. It's interesting that you mentioned accessibility as well, Doctor, because I know that as part of the work you've been doing, you've used an element of a telehealth model too.
Yeah.
Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. So uncharacteristically, I usually only see my patients one, maybe twice in person. Twice as if I'm testing them and then fitting them. But normally I see my patients for a telehealth consultation, meaning they are bringing their test results from another provider. They're bringing me all of the information that I've requested, and we meet each other just like how you and I are meeting today. And we do our full consultation via telehealth. I hold multi-state licensures all across predominantly the Western United States, but that's got a little bit further reach sometimes. And this is how we meet for the first time, and we do our full consultation. And then I have remote field clinics that I rotate around to different parts of the country. So I'm headed out here soon to another field clinic. I just returned a week ago from another field clinic, and I rotate to these different parts of the country to help bring accessible tinnitus care to a home near you rather than having everybody come to Alaska. And so during these field clinics, that's when I meet them physically for the first time, is when I'm completing the fitting of their Lenire device. And then we transition back to telehealth. So their follow-up care then is also via telehealth. So this is my spot. This is where I hang out. This is where I see 90% of my patients. And then, like I said, I do see people for those in-person fittings, but most of my work happens right here at my desk with my computer, with my patient in their kind of comfy space on their computer. And this is where we do all of our work.
And have
so
you,
it's a little different.
Yeah, have you noticed any difference in the outcomes in those coming to see you physically and those having telecare?
So we did actually pull that data of my local Alaskans of whom I provided in-person care and my telecare, and we did not see any difference from that angle. And so I even give my Alaskans the option now of, if you would like to do telecare, you can, because it's convenient. But yeah, so actually, and I know that depending upon where you're located, that might be a very different type of healthcare that you've not received before. But I was excited to not only see that the Lenire worked, but to be able to finally show patients and people and other providers that telemedicine works when used effectively as well, because my data is all telemedical data. In this particular paper, we didn't put the breakdowns, but a very small portion of my Lenire compared to the large aggregate is in-person care, just because I cover such a large representation of where I do these field clinics at. And so it didn't matter. It didn't matter if they were in person, and it didn't matter if they were in telehealth. Our outcome measures were showing consistent clinical data. And I think that's wonderful, because maybe the provider closest to you, for whatever reason, you don't feel comfortable with. Maybe you have a driving barrier. Maybe you need transportation and you can't always rely on someone for transportation. Maybe you live really rural. I live in Alaska. I'm used to rural life. But most of the United States has large pockets of heavily rural, non-accessible locations. And so not every patient has a clinic 5 miles near them. And so I think that really opened up the door, that just because you live far away, or maybe you have a transportation barrier or a mobility barrier, or maybe you just can't leave your home some days because of your tinnitus, we can still do tinnitus care. We can still do follow-up. We can still work together utilizing telemedicine from the safety and comfort of their home without a barrier of burdening maybe a child or a transportation service or a very long commute into an office. And so it really opened up the accessibility of, maybe I don't live near you, but I come near you pretty often because I rotate around and I spend a lot of times flying from field clinic to field clinic. But I do that so that we can bring care more accessible to a place near my patients. And then I get to come back to my home and do all of their telemedicine care, and they're safe and I'm safe at home with my husband and little ones.
I think you mentioned a really interesting point there, which is if people have to travel, if they have to get out of their comfort zones, if they have to go a long way, or maybe they're anxious, they're stressed, they're overwhelmed, that's the last thing that you want to give to somebody who suffers with tinnitus, because that will exacerbate the tinnitus. There might be some level of white coat syndrome as well. So if they could be going through this process in the comfort of their own home, I'm sure that will have, if anything, a more positive impact than having to, I don't know, sit on the highway, drive away, get stressed by that, et cetera, et cetera. So it'd be interesting to see further research on that going forwards as well. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, it was definitely a little gamble early in the beginning of doing this model. Like I said, we do fittings in person and then all follow up and often all pre-care via telemedicine. But thankfully, it did not go the wrong direction, and it has been incredibly instrumental.
I've got one last question for you,
sure,
Doctor. So thank you. I've taken up way too much of your time. But last question is about those patients who have tried Lenire and they haven't responded as well as you'd have hoped. And you mentioned there's a handful of patients out there. I think you said 8.5%. As far as your next steps, what would your approach be with those guys?
Yeah. So, and remember, this is a very general answer because it's a little easier when you've got a real person with case information in front of you. But kind of in general, I like to take a step back and look at what the patient had done prior to coming in. Maybe we had not done piece A and they really felt strongly about kind of this option and we went for that option. So then do we need to build a different part into it? Sometimes those patients will be incredibly compliant. I am not saying that someone that was not successful with Lenire did not do Lenire. I want to be very clear on that. But sometimes they have so perfectly completed everything you have asked of them, and we just didn't see change. Sometimes for that patient, I generally will say that one of my first recommendations at that point is, if they have not already, moving them into a cognitive behavioral therapy program, whether they're more comfortable with a one-on-one with a psychologist, or whether they want to utilize a program like Auto and being able to look at it from that angle. Because at that point, I'm just wondering kind of what's stopping their brain from clearly having done the activity and not letting them go to that next level. And so sometimes I think that that's a really powerful moment to bring cognitive behavioral therapy in. I've then seen people go through a successful CBT program and then be able to re-implement Lenire at a later date once we've kind of gotten through that like mental barrier, so to say. If they are a patient of whom maybe has hearing loss that wasn't addressed, doing a trial, which in my clinic then is not with me, because I don't personally fit hearing aids outside of Alaska because I'm in a variety of clinics and locations and sometimes hotels, and I don't always have the equipment. So if they need a referral for amplification, I send them to a trusted audiologist in a community near them. So for me, if they're an Alaskan, then I would say that's what we're headed to. But for my non-Alaskan patients, I will help get you connected with an excellent provider that follows best practices. And sometimes we just need a timeout. Sometimes it's okay to say, I have too much going on. And maybe what is best in this moment is to just say, I need a little bit of a break. Because I think sometimes we're just so programmed to keep going and to keep going and to keep going that we just get exhausted, truly. And so sometimes we'll just take a little brain time out, and I will do a follow-up with them in usually 1 to 2 weeks to just see, how has the timeout gone? Do we maybe just need to take a little bit of focus off the tinnitus? Do we need a little less activity? Do we need a little less burden into our lives? And just kind of see if they are having changes with that break, we are going to lean into that and we're going to go that direction. Maybe that was just a bad time of them for life. Maybe there was a big life change. Maybe there's a big job change. And it's not that we couldn't use tools, but right now tools were seen more as a burden rather than a successful therapeutic tool. And so I think just kind of looking at that. And then there are some patients that I wish I had the answer. I do. But they were not responsive. It just didn't work. And those are the people that, while it's not the answer I wish that I had, it's also the reason that we keep continuing. It's the reason that myself and my colleagues, that we keep looking, we keep working, we keep gathering the data, because I don't think there's ever going to be one tool for every single person. Just like I don't think there's one hearing aid for every single person. But I do hope that as we get more information and as we get more data collected, that we can start seeing, what did those non-responders have that we didn't catch, or that we didn't know, or that we didn't know to look for, so that, okay, maybe this didn't work, but you know what we've been really successful with? This for an alternative option. And so it's not the answer that I wish I had, but it's the answer that we're working towards. Is I am so thrilled that the majority, the true vast majority, have found success. But I'm not done doing this work, and I'm not done, and I know my colleagues aren't done, until we can hopefully be able to figure out how do we close that gap, even if it's a different tool, and it most likely will be. And what is that tool, and how do we get to that point? And that's where science, and that's where our data, and that's where our training, and then not my training, but my friends with PhDs and their research training, that's where they come into play, because that is not my realm of the world. And that's where, you know, we all get to work together and hopefully be able to find kind of those next pieces. So, you know, in general, I like to tell my patients that even though it is a hard day when we decide that that person wasn't a responder, but don't completely give up hope. There are still other things that we can do. There are other tools that we can work on, just management. And then hopefully the next big breakthrough will be the best solution for them, and being able to continue looking forward in that right direction.
Thank you. Good answer.
Thank you.
Anyone with tinnitus is clearly lucky to have you looking after their ears. So I'm really grateful for your time today. And can I ask, when there's more research and more data, can I get you back on to share your story with that as well?
Sure. We'll happily span the 9-hour time difference and make it happen.
I love it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And for anyone listening, I hope that you were able to gain some helpful information today.